Introduction to Human Resources Management, Chapter 11, Separating and Retaining Employees. We previously discussed the importance of creating a sustainable competitive advantage and how retaining good employees is a key component of that task. Retaining good employees also helps to retain customers and can increase sales because if you retain the best employees, they're likely to be the ones that are the most effective and efficient and therefore the most productive. In general, studies have shown that organizations with low turnover and satisfied employees do tend to perform at a higher level, and if you are able to maintain that performance, you are able to get that competitive advantage. The next slide asks why you may have ever quit a job that you've held previously. Some of the selections that people come up with, they didn't like their boss or their coworkers. I said previously, oftentimes people take a job to go for the company because they like what the company does, the type of work that it is, but they end up leaving because of their boss. They don't like the way that they're being treated. They don't like the management style. They may also have issues with other colleagues and coworkers. Employees may not be a good fit with a company culture. They may get better pay somewhere else, which is incumbent upon HR to make sure that they're paying a competitive wage to reduce the likelihood of people leaving for that reason. If the jobs that people are working are not interesting or challenging, they may leave to go to another job where they feel that that will be fulfilled. And other reasons may be that they were fired. Usually fired means that you were terminated for cause, that you did something wrong or you were not performing well enough, or you were laid off, which was not due to any cause. It was simply because the company had made a strategic decision to reduce the workforce. Turnover refers to the number of people who leave an organization over a period of time. If you have a high rate of turnover, that means that you're spending a lot more time or an inordinate amount of time hiring and training new workers, which can lead to less productivity. There are two types of turnover: voluntary and involuntary. Voluntary turnover is usually when an employee makes the determination that they want to leave the job. It's typically initiated by the employee, and it often happens when an organization would like to keep that employee, and it can often happen because the employee elects to retire or move on to another job. Involuntary turnover is typically initiated by the employer, and that often occurs when employees would prefer to stay. That would result in job termination, either firing an employee or having an employee leave during a layoff. When an employee leaves, it's referred to as separation from the organization. So separating employees is a big part of what HR and the managers that work in the organization have to deal with. When you manage involuntary turnover, that's taking care of the processes in place to make sure that any layoffs are done in accordance with the law and existing policies in the company to make sure that any such terminations are done fair and that they are legally defensible. What we mean by legally defensible is to have enough evidence in court to justify your actions and not be held liable for any damages. The best way to do that is to collect enough information to support the decision for the involuntary separation. Oftentimes I've had, in my role as an attorney, I've had managers come to me and tell me that they need to fire an employee because they're not performing well. My first question is, let me see your performance reviews. If you haven't done an adequate job of conducting a performance review to establish a track record and a paper trail that an employee has an issue, then it may be more difficult if you make an action to separate that employee involuntarily because you have not really compiled enough information to justify that action. If you have an employee that is not performing well, that should be documented. If you surprise an employee who thinks that they're doing fine because their manager hasn't told them of any issues, that's the type of employee that will take umbrage with being separated involuntarily, and they may think that it's for a reason that is not supported, which could be something that would be illegal, and they may have grounds to have a court action proceed. On the other side of the coin, you want to retain employees as well, especially, most obviously, the best employees. You don't want them to be leaving because of the cost that it would incur to the company if they left in terms of their ability, and to replace them, you would have to go through the recruitment and selection process as well. If you want to minimize voluntary turnover, the best way to do it is to let management know what type of benefits are available, the best way to manage their employees. You want to be able to make sure that there's fairly meted out discipline. You want to promote employee engagement, keep them interested in the job. You don't want to have job withdrawal, and we'll get to that in a moment about what the stages of that may be. You also want to do things that would help improve job satisfaction, and we had talked about certain things that could be done in previous chapters that could make jobs more interesting and cater to your employees to keep them more interested in staying on the position. Whenever you have turnover, whether it's voluntary or involuntary, there are costs associated with that. For involuntary turnover, when the employer is taking action to reduce the workforce, you will then probably, even if you're laying off an entire group of people because their jobs are obsolete, you may be moving into another area of customer service or production or manufacturing where you may need to hire other people. So if you're doing a mass layoff for one reason, you may need to be doing mass hirings as a result as well. You could also be terminating people because of their lack of performance. In either of those outcomes, you're going to have to recruit, select, and train new people to come in. And again, there is time and money associated with those as costs. You will have lost productivity. If you have someone leaving, whatever job that they were doing, they're not doing it anymore. And if it needs to continue to be done, it will either not get done, or you will have to assign some tasks to existing employees, which could overstress them a little bit in their jobs. So you do want to quickly bring in more people when it's appropriate to do so, to avoid creating a burden on your existing employees and reducing their likelihood of being retained as well. Another cost with involuntary turnover I alluded to earlier, you may end up getting sued if you don't have a good way to defend the actions that you're taking. And the other thing, unfortunately, that does sometimes result is workplace violence. People are upset that they're losing their job. A lot of people associate their job with their personal well-being. Their ability to perform successfully means that they are going to be able to pay for their rent. They're going to be able to support their children and their families. When that's taken away from them, they sometimes act out violently. And managers and HR need to be aware that that is a potential outcome, and you need to take steps to try and prevent that. But it can be, whether there's workplace violence or not, or you're doing things to try to minimize workplace violence, that does take effort. And because of that and the associated time involved, there is a cost associated with that as well. For voluntary turnover, when an employee decides that they want to leave of their own volition, you're not going to probably get workplace violence as a result of that, but you are going to have to recruit, select, and train their replacements. Again, you will have that lost productivity because that job is no longer being performed by the person who left. And if you have really quality employees, the type that give you this competitive advantage that you're trying to maintain, that is going to lead to a loss in productivity, which will have a cost to the organization. We mentioned at-will employment previously. That is important to keep in mind when you're talking about voluntary and involuntary turnover. When you have employment at will, that means the organization and the employee do not have a contract. They are hired of their own volition. You, or as the employer or the employee, may at any time end the relationship, either for cause or for no cause. If you are an employer and you're ending employment, you have to make sure that whatever reason it is not going to violate any law. It has to be a legally justifiable action. The text does mention the issue of implied contracts. A contract, as I mentioned earlier, is an agreement between two parties that is legally enforceable under law. So that is, one side has agreed to do something, the other party has agreed to do something, and it is backed by consideration or something of value. In the workplace, that is typically a salary. You agreed to do work, I agreed to pay you. That is potentially a contractual grounds for having a legally enforceable agreement. Even though it's an at-will situation and you do not have a contract, employers have to be careful not to create a situation where a court could interpret there being a contract, even if you did not expressly come out and enter into an agreement. Contrary to popular belief, not all contracts have to be in writing. There are certain cases where verbal contracts are enforceable. If a manager makes a promise to an employee that they will not fire them, that they'll have a job ready for them, that they'll have a certain amount of pay, and then that employee relies on that promise in a reasonable manner, if that does not come through, if it does not come through to fruition, then the employee may be able to have grounds to have a legal action for an implied contract. So managers and HR should all be aware, whatever it is that you're promising to people, be careful, because if it is something that someone takes action for and causes them to incur some type of expense. If you promise me a job in California and I quit my job and I move to California and I show up at the door and you tell me there's no job for me, that could be considered consideration because I did something of value or I incurred some type of expense on a reasonable belief that your promise was going to be fulfilled. Public policy is slightly different from law. In court, some decisions are not made because you violated a law, but because you didn't do something that was considered to be fair. And they throw that under the umbrella of a public policy determination. So it's a little bit nebulous and it's harder to understand. You should always be in touch with your attorneys, whether you have one on staff or if you have a law firm that's retained for these types of issues. You want to make sure if you're going to be laying off an individual or a group of individuals that you're not violating public policy. Certainly you don't want to violate the law, but public policy can be a little bit more of a nuanced issue that you should double check with your attorneys on. Outside of the actual contract, the legally enforceable contract, there is something of a psychological contract, this informal agreement and expectations between employer and employee. Workers tend to feel that they do owe the employer something, but if they're an employee at will, they feel probably rightly, a sense that they should take care of themselves. They need to do what's best for their own career and move it forward. So the likelihood of them having loyalty to the employer is not as strong as you may think. If you have a great place to work and people don't want to leave and people want to come, you will have some degree of loyalty. But in the end of the day, if somebody's not happy with their job, if they're an employee at will, they will leave because they do have an expectation through the psychological contract that they should be getting something that should fulfill what their career objectives are. And if the job isn't doing it for them, they may leave. That is the main reason why retaining talent can be quite a challenge. Even if you think that you have a job that is fulfilling everything, you really don't know what an employee is thinking unless you really ask them, and even then they may not disclose exactly what it is that could be an issue for them. So oftentimes you may be surprised. You have an employee that you thought was performing at a high level, they're perfectly happy with the job, everything seemed to be great, and then the next thing you know, you have a letter of resignation on your desk. So it can be quite challenging to keep people in because this idea of the psychological contract is this expectations, and an individual is going to have their own subjective requirements that they feel should be fulfilled. When employee separation is on the table, just like we talked about earlier, you should have policies and procedures for anything that HR does, and that includes for when people are leaving, whether it be voluntary or involuntarily. Handling employee separation should not be left to the discretion of an individual manager or supervisor. If a manager or supervisor feels that they need to take action, they need to go to their boss or they need to go to HR to ensure that whatever process is in place is followed. Any of these processes should be based on principles of justice and law, which we'll get into in the next couple of slides. And you should have various ways for others to intervene so that if there is a problem that arises, there are resources available to both the employee and the employer, whether it's a manager or a supervisor, through HR so that they can get the resources they need to be able to go through this process. Principles of justice include the concepts of outcome fairness, procedural justice, and interactional justice. Slide 10 does have this graphic on it. We're going to go through each one in a little bit more detail. Outcome fairness really goes to whether or not an employee is able to determine that the consequences of a decision are justified or just and equitable. If you have outcome fairness, that means that you're following these due process considerations and treating all employees the same and consistently. If an employee gets a decision that they're not happy with, if you have outcome fairness, they may not be happy with the outcome, but they may not have anything to complain about regarding the process that led to it. So if an employee ends up getting terminated for cause because they did something wrong, it's in your employee handbook, and others who have done the same thing met the same result. You can at least explain the situation to them and show them that even if they're not happy with the outcome is not targeting them. They are experiencing exactly what anybody in the similar situation would have experienced. So the idea is that you want to have outcome fairness, you want to treat everybody fairly. You also need to communicate all of these policies and procedures to people so that they understand what they are going into a situation. If you know what to expect because the policies have been communicated correctly and clearly, then there's less likelihood that somebody could take umbrage with this outcome fairness issue. If they're being treated exactly the way that they were told that they would be treated, there's less opportunity for conflict. Whenever you're taking action that could include separation, you need to make sure that if you're doing some type of discipline that's leading to termination, that the outcome, the termination, is proportionate to the behavior at hand. There are some circumstances when we're talking about discipline and progressive discipline that you wouldn't start off by firing somebody. You would want to sit down with them, ask them what's going on, do a performance review, get a good conversation going so that if there is an issue and it's not something so significant that you need to take immediate action, that you can come up with some way of mitigating the problem or solving the problem, because there are costs associated with this, as I said, going in either direction. Whether it's going to be voluntary turnover or involuntary turnover, if the employer is seeking to involuntarily separate someone from the organization, it should be for a reason that's going to be worth it. Otherwise, you're going to have to hire somebody new, and if it was a problem that could have been corrected, you will end up losing money down the road. The next bucket that we're looking at is procedural justice. This relates to procedures. So the policies that you have to follow procedures to be able to effectuate them. So in addition to the outcome being fair, you want to make sure that the procedures were fair, that you had your opportunity to be heard, that if there was some type of procedure that you had to follow, that it was afforded to you and that it was conducted in a fair manner. Interactional justice relates to how people interact with one another. So you want to talk about how managers interact with employees. Even if you're taking action against an employee that has been performing at a bad level, they are essentially a bad employee, they've been creating problems, that does not give anyone license to treat them unprofessionally or without empathy, because no one wants to lose their job no matter how deserving they may end up being. Managers should always explain to the employee what action is happening, how it's procedurally just, explain the outcomes that may be on the table, but following these principles of interactional justice, it's really important to make sure that it's communicated to the employees so that they understand what's going on. And we talked about the potential for violence. Places that have violent outcomes are the ones where people feel like they've been treated unfairly. And as I said, you're never going to solve this issue. You're never going to make everybody happy all of the time. But even if you have a bad outcome, people may think that at least they were treated fairly throughout the process. That minimizes the opportunity that you could have negative outcomes. For employee separation, there are various legal requirements. When you're talking about terminating an employee, whether it's for cause or whether it's because it's a layoff of some sort, you have to be careful not to violate any principles of wrongful discharge. So you can't have a violation of an implied agreement. That's kind of that implied contract that we were referring to before. So if you promise somebody job security and then they turn down other jobs as a result, they've given up something of value in response to that promise that you've made. So even if you didn't sign a contract and say, we're guaranteeing that you're going to have a job here, if you've made that type of a promise and then violated it, that could be an implied agreement or an implied contract. When you have these policies and procedures, this psychological contract comes forward again because it is implied and it's expected that if you have these policies in place, the employer will follow them and afford those opportunities to be heard and due process considerations to all employees equally. If you take action with one employee that's inconsistent with the rules and they have been treated inequitably compared to other employees, that is also kind of a violation. It may be an explicit violation of the policies, but it's an implied agreement that you will follow those policies. So that could also lead to a wrongful discharge complaint. You cannot violate public policy, terminate an employee for asking them to do something illegal when they refuse to do so. You can't obviously take action and fire someone because they got married or if they belong to a particular demographic that's protected under federal and state law. That's kind of a no-brainer, but there are some more subtle areas that you need to be careful of. Any action that is taken, you want to make sure it's done in a non-discriminatory manner. You have to make sure that any decisions that are being made are not being conducted because a manager has any type of implicit or explicit bias against people regarding their age, sex, race, or any other protected status under the law. We mentioned earlier that it's also important to carefully document any discipline that happens and to do these performance evaluations and make sure that everything is documented, because the minute you take action and you end up in court, the first thing they're going to be asking for is, why did you do this? And if you have documentation going back a month, 2 months, 6 months, a year, saying that this person has had a problem, they've been addressed over and over again and it's not getting any better, that can be the justification for it. If you are taking action and you don't have anything to back it up, you are much more likely to have a complaint filed in court, and it's going to be more difficult for the organization to defend itself because you haven't documented the reasons for which you are taking the action. We mentioned multiple times before, employee separation includes employee privacy issues. Any information that you gathered for use in discipline must also be relevant to what's going on. It has to have something to do with the outcome. You can't complain about something if somebody's doing something that you don't like that is not necessarily a violation of your policies or procedures. It can't be something that you personally think that they should be doing. It should be something that is established that they should be doing. Any information that is collected regarding employee discipline should also be kept confidential, so no one else should have access to an employee's file regarding discipline unless it is backed by a business reason to see it. Under the law, relevant information is anything that is more likely than not to prove something to be true. If you are collecting information about someone's background, whether or not they have blue eyes or if they're left-handed has nothing to do with whether they can do the job correctly. What you want to do is look at the core competencies and the performance requirements, and if they are not performing them at a level that has been established, then that would be relevant, but you want to make sure that you keep anything that is irrelevant out of it. Making sure that everybody understands what's going on if there is going to be some type of an investigation for disciplinary actions. Putting it in your policies and procedures is a good idea. Communicating that to employees through emails and handbooks and training is also a good idea so that people understand the processes that are in play here. When it's necessary to get consent, you want to ask for it before you gather information. Other employees may not necessarily be willing or required to provide information. They may not know about information. You don't want to be in a situation where a manager is putting pressure on someone to say something. So talking to people, asking if they'd be willing to participate and contribute is a very key issue here. Throughout the process, all employees should be treated consistently. If they have to do a search of any personal information or any of their personal effects, you have to do that discreetly. People do have a right of privacy at work, but not for work items. So if I have a desk, it's owned by my boss. It's owned by the company. If I have work files, people can go through my files if there's a business reason to do so. If there's an expectation of privacy, if I'm in the bathroom, if I have a locked drawer where I can keep my personal effects, my wallet, my ID, then there may be some issues as to whether or not the employer can actually go through and search that. So you may need to get consent for certain things that you may want to look for. But if you're going to do a search, if you have to conduct a search of someone's locker to see if they're stealing any supplies or anything like that, you don't want to do it in front of everybody else if you can avoid it. So do it discreetly, make sure that you're protecting people's privacy and their dignity as well, because oftentimes when you do an investigation of somebody because you think that they're doing something wrong, they may not have been doing something wrong, and you don't want to create a problem where one doesn't actually exist. When layoffs are taking place and you're doing large-scale layoffs, you may be subject to the Workers' Adjustment Retraining and Notification Act, otherwise known by the acronym of WARN. You have to give notice if you are laying off a certain number of people and you're a large enough organization before you close the company down or give any notices for layoffs for people. A couple of years ago when Elon Musk purchased Twitter, he laid off a whole bunch of people, and there were complaints and there were legal actions taken because he laid off a large number of people and he did not, arguably or allegedly, give the adequate notice under the statute that was required to be given. Progressive discipline simply means that you start off with an appropriate level of discipline and then it increases as is necessary. When someone shows up 5 minutes late for work, you shouldn't start by firing them. You should start by saying, hey, you kind of made a mistake here. You came in a little bit late. Was there anything going on? Was there a lot of traffic? Then that's fine to have that type of discussion, and then they'll be aware that that was an issue that they need to take care of. If they come in late every day for a week, then maybe you need to step it up a little bit and have more of a formal explanation or a formal discussion with them. If they're always late for a month, then maybe you need to sit down and have a formal issue, put something in their file, maybe even suspend them without pay for a particular amount of time. If they are always going to be late, if they're coming in late, leaving early, taking long lunches, they're not doing the work that they're supposed to be doing, then after you've done all of this other stuff, you could step it up to maybe threatening to fire them, to terminate their employment. And if it never gets corrected, then you may have to follow through and do that. But progressive discipline suggests that you start off appropriately with a lower level of discipline and then increase it appropriately throughout the process. Progressive discipline is based on the idea of the hot stove. If you've ever touched a hot stove, it's hot, it burns you, you say ow, and you don't touch it again because it gives you immediate feedback that there's something going on. The idea of the hot stove is something that managers should keep in place. If somebody does something wrong, it's important to address it with them immediately, to let them know what was going on is not appropriate, so that they get that feedback immediately. What they did is not appropriate, it needs to be corrected, and they should not be doing it again. The next column here, we're talking about progressive discipline, like I've already mentioned. So things that could be starting off at a lower level, that it goes up to higher levels: tardiness and absenteeism, unsafe work practices, poor quality of work, sexual harassment of colleagues, theft, cyber slacking. Cyber slacking is basically goofing off and looking at the internet and buying stuff online instead of doing your job or going to social media, things like that. Some things are going to be much higher levels than others, and you don't necessarily have to start off at a lower level. I've unfortunately been in a situation where one member of our staff physically assaulted another during lunchtime, punched the person in the mouth and knocked them out. We did not start with progressive discipline there. We fired that person immediately. So we collected their materials, got the security, called the police, and then escorted them to the front door, and they were terminated immediately. So progressive discipline makes sense, and you should always follow it, but there are certain things that are not going to be qualified for progressive discipline. If it's something that egregious, right at the outset, you start at the end game. You terminate that employee. If it's something like sexual harassment of coworkers, depending on the nature of the complaint, the evidence that you have, you may need to step up very quickly. All instances of harassment, sexual or otherwise, should be taken seriously and addressed by management, because you don't want to end up with a hostile work environment label. That makes it a lot easier for employees to sue you and successfully get damages at the end of the day. By addressing issues when they come in immediately, you can minimize the probability that you have a hostile work environment. The next slide just shows a graphical illustration of what I was referring to before. Depending, let's say it's a minor issue, depending on how severe it is, you may give them an unofficial spoken warning, then an official written warning, a second warning with a threat that if they don't fix the problem, there's going to be more serious consequences. You may suspend them or dock their pay and give them another notice that if they don't take action, they may see discipline up to and including termination of employment. And then the last result is going to be termination. Part of the reason progressive discipline is useful is because it's a fair way of doing it. It also can save money because if you immediately jump to termination, you start throwing out employees and getting rid of employees that could otherwise be redeemable. And you don't necessarily want to go through the expense of hiring somebody else if you can fix the problem first. Alternative dispute resolution is a key issue for management because you want to avoid going to court. The American legal system is known as an adversarial system, and it means that one side is going up against the other, and typically one side will win and one side will lose. There's very little room for negotiation and settlement. That's not to say that a court case couldn't result in a settlement, but if you go to trial, they're not going to come up with some kind of a compromise. One side is going to win and one side is going to lose. Lawyers may try to negotiate a settlement before you get there, which could include a compromise. But if you're in the court system, everybody's lawyered up, you're paying your legal fees, it costs a lot of money, it takes a lot of time, and it can result in a lot of hard feelings between staff and management. Alternative dispute resolution is a way to resolve issues before they become so significant that they have to go to the legal system. 4 key ways of doing is to have management with an open door policy so that they're willing to talk to people. You can have peer review where others will get involved. Other employees, other managers can help resolve an issue before it becomes problematic. And you can also have mediation and arbitration. We'll talk about each of these in the following slides. Open door policy refers to the image of a manager having their door open and available so that if anybody has an issue, they can walk in when they need to and discuss it with management. Having that open door policy, open communication going both ways, can really identify issues or help identify issues before they become real big problems so that management can take actions. Employees get the impression that they're being listened to so that they don't feel like they're being ignored and they have no recourse. That can help a huge amount to resolve issues and minimize problems before they actually turn into something more significant. Peer review helps to resolve problems because you can have a panel of peers, whether it's the employee has their own peers that can listen to an issue and try to figure out the best way to pursue a resolution. It could also be made from other representatives from cross-sections of the organizational divisions so that people can give you other ideas and maybe come up with new ideas for solutions before problems become so adverse that you end up going to the court system. Mediation involves the employment of a mediator, which is an independent person that will come in and try to resolve a problem. They basically facilitate a conversation between two parties that have an issue and try to come up with some type of a specified path for a resolution. Mediation does not involve a decision that's being made, and a mediator should not really be empowered to make a decision. The mediator's job is to facilitate open conversations and get everybody moving towards some type of a solution that they can both agree to. Arbitration can be binding. Most of the time it is. You can also have non-binding arbitration, but typically it is binding, specifically if you have union employees and you have a collective bargaining agreement that usually calls for binding arbitration. Arbitration, instead of having a mediator, you would have an arbitrator, and the arbitrator would be the person that would have the authority to make a decision. So you might be able to come to a settlement through mediation, but if you can't, an arbitrator will actually make a decision similar to what a court would do, what a judge would do. It's cheaper because you don't have to go to court to do it. The parties should have an agreement that they would have this process available to them. Professional arbitrators are usually lawyers or ex-judges that come in and they hear the case and then they make a decision. So you still get this adversarial decision-making where you may not get a settlement as a result of it, but you do get to have a decision that hopefully isn't following with your policies and procedures and issues of fairness and due process without having to go to a court system to do it, so it can actually save time and money in that regard. When employees are separated, particularly when they're involuntarily separated, they may have a lot of anguish, they may be upset. It can be a psychologically difficult thing to get through. Employee assistance programs are usually offered through health programs, through the benefit package that a lot of employers offer. And it's a referral service where if you need to get psychological counseling, you can get mental health, substance abuse, and other personal issues. They can give you some consultation and help you get through it. A lot of EAP programs are integrated through the healthcare programs. And when people are laid off, they are often referred to them. They can include even not necessarily specifically for things like psychological help, but you can also help people go to a job placement center if you know that people are going to be losing their jobs. You can give them access to other tools that they can get to help find a new job. But also the EAP program is largely to help people process what's going on and to be able to get through it. The next slide I've already talked over a little bit. That was made an allusion to this outplacement counseling. So you could have a job placement firm so that people who are laid off, they may feel angry and confused. If you can offer them some assistance to be able to find a new job or to get a referral to another job, that can go a long way towards keeping the situation manageable. Minimizing employee turnover from the involuntary turnover where people are quitting, keeping people engaged is pretty important. It usually leads to job satisfaction. If people are engaged, they feel less likely to take umbrage with what their manager is doing or their salary and other things. They tend to feel more associated with the job that they have. They feel pride in their job. They feel more connected to the workplace. If you have engaged employees because you've given them the opportunity to give some opinions, where you ask them their ideas, they're involved in the things that are going on and they're not just being dictated to by management, they tend to perform with higher productivity. They tend to be happier on the job. And if they're interacting with customers, they will provide better customer service. And if they're engaged, satisfied, and motivated to be on the job, they're less likely to leave. So you would have lower rates of turnover. If you have disengaged employees, people are not happy with the job for various reasons, they have low levels of satisfaction, they may start the process known as job withdrawal. These are a series of behaviors that employees start to exhibit when they are not physically, mentally, or emotionally tied to the job, or they're not satisfied with the job. There's three main types of withdrawal: behavioral change, physical job withdrawal, and psychological job withdrawal. Sometimes the behaviors can kind of be lumped into what is known as quiet quitting. Behavioral change, people may not be as outgoing, they may not be as willing to attend meetings, or if they're in meetings, they're not volunteering information. They're just going with the flow. They're not really doing anything. They're not taking the initiative. They're doing what they need to do to get by, to be able to keep their job and get a paycheck, but they're not really performing at a higher level. Physical job withdrawal is when you have taken that behavioral change to the next level, where you are physically just not showing up as much. You're taking all of the time off that you have. You're calling in sick a lot. You're showing up late. You're leaving early. You're taking long lunches. You don't like the job, and therefore you don't want to do it quite so much. So you now are physically not performing the job the way that you should be. Psychological withdrawal is when you've just decided that you're not being treated fairly. It's not a good place to be. That can lead to that, behavioral change and this quiet quitting that we alluded to. The things that lead to job dissatisfaction and ultimately job withdrawal can be personal dispositions. Some people are just not going to be happy on the job. You could have the best job in the world and 20 people report to you. There's probably always going to be one or two that aren't happy with it. Sometimes you'll have people working in what you would consider to be very challenging jobs who love it. And that's due in part to their personal disposition. They're happy to have a job. They want to do a job well. They have an intrinsic motivating factor where they want to perform at a high level. Some people are simply easier to deal with than others, which is the truth of the matter. Some people are just never going to be happy with a job. Some people are going to be dissatisfied with a job because they have good reason to be. But you have to understand that every person is going to be an individual, and every individual has different motivating factors. So you may think that employees should be perfectly happy on the job, and they're not. And that's largely due to the way that they are, but also due to the way you are. You may view the job as a great job. You're not necessarily the one doing it if you're the manager. There can be this misalignment between expectations of what management and what employees feel. Tasks and roles, if it's not an interesting job, if there's not a lot of engagement, if there's not a lot of empowerment where employees have to do what they're told, they act mostly like robots. They have micromanagers telling them what to do every step of the way. That can lead to some problems with satisfaction. You may not be happy with your colleagues. You may not be happy with your bosses. You may not be happy with the benefits that you get or the amount of pay that you're getting. Sometimes any one of those things or any combination of all of those things can lead to job dissatisfaction, which then can lead to this job withdrawal and quiet quitting. One of the things about personal dispositions, some people have a negative affectivity. They just kind of see the glass as half empty. They have a low level of satisfaction, just kind of in general. These employees are going to be very difficult to keep satisfied no matter what you do. I don't want to throw everything into that box, though, because a lot of managers will use this as an excuse. A lot of bad managers specifically will just say, well, it's just these people don't know what they're doing. They're not really motivated correctly. It does happen sometimes, but it doesn't happen all the time. So keep that in mind when you're looking at someone. It may be that they have a negative affectivity. It may be because they're in a difficult situation, no matter what their affectivity is. Tasks and roles, we mentioned very briefly as well. The complexity of the task, if you have a really simple job and you do it over and over again, your average person's probably going to get sick of it. That can lead to job dissatisfaction. That's why things like job rotation and job enlargement, things of that nature, can help make the job more interesting. Role ambiguity is when someone doesn't really know what is expected of them because their manager or their supervisor or the job in general has not been designed well enough so that they understand what the requirements of the job are. You can also have role conflict. We talked about putting people on teams. A lot of times people work on teams when they're working on a project. You could find yourself on 3 different projects, responding or reporting to 3 different managers. Those managers could be telling you to do different things that could conflict. One says that they want you to do something at one time of the day, the other one wants you to do something at the same time of the day. You don't really have any way as an employee to figure out how to resolve that conflict, so that can create a lot of dissatisfaction with the job as well. You could also have role overload, which sometimes happens as a result of layoffs. When people leave, other people may have to pick up the job that is not being done, or at least a portion of that job that's not being done. They could end up doing a lot more work than they were hired to do. They see that as unfair, and that can lead to dissatisfaction on the job. So as we mentioned, supervisors and coworkers and pay and benefits can be a problem. Conflict between employees often leads to them leaving the job if they can't figure out a way to resolve it. Pay and benefits, people often really look at their job as a reflection of who they are as a person, rightly or wrongly. In the United States, if you go to a party somewhere, one of the first things that a new person that you meet is going to ask you is what you do. A lot of people define themselves by what they do. And if they get a job and they're not being paid what they feel is a fair wage, they can take that very personally because a lot of people take their jobs very seriously. So if you don't have good pay, it could be an indication that you're not being valued as well, and that can lead to dissatisfaction. For role conflict, being in the military, if you're a reservist and you get deployed and you get called up, that can also lead to conflict because instead of having multiple bosses at your own job, you have your boss in the military and they're telling you that you have to go and do something. That can lead to some issues when they leave the job and when they come back. So for job withdrawal, the behavioral change, one of the things that they look at is known as whistleblowing. If you're a sports fan, a referee will blow the whistle when somebody does something wrong and they take action to correct it. You may have something in your organization where you are regulated by the government. If somebody feels that they're not happy at the job and they're not being treated fairly, they may call the press, they may call the government and report issues that they feel are inappropriate. That can lead to problems for the company. Now, if the company's doing something wrong, they shouldn't be doing something wrong in the first place. But it's best to be able to police what's going on internally and fix it by getting this open feedback and this open door policy. You find out that there are problems, you can take action to correct it. If you don't have an open door policy and people just stew in their dissatisfaction of the job, they may take more serious action and the company could have a bigger problem on their hands as a result. So people could do whistleblowing, they could file lawsuits, and they could get help outside of the organization if they don't see the organization as being able to help them solve their problem directly. We mentioned physical job withdrawal, tardiness, absenteeism. Resigning is the ultimate physical job withdrawal. Eventually, they just get fed up and quit. That would be the end game, but you could have this quiet quitting, various manifestations of it along the way that could lead to a reduction in productivity. Psychological withdrawal, they're not really thinking of the job because they don't value it as much anymore. They don't think that they're valued, therefore they do not value the job. They become less involved in the job and they're not as committed to the organization. They will not stand up and take action to be able to help the organization succeed. Well, we keep talking about job satisfaction, but what it is just feeling good about the job. It's a pleasant feeling that your job fulfills what you were doing, that it's important. It's important to you, it's important to the organization, it's important to the industry. The 3 things about job satisfaction that you want to look at are values, perceptions, and ideas about what is important. We already mentioned personal dispositions and negative affectivity. That can be something associated with job dissatisfaction, and as I noted, that is a problem sometimes. It's also good to hire people that don't have negative affectivity. So when you're doing the recruitment and selection, to whatever degree you can hire people that don't have a negative outlook, that can help resolve this issue. But again, be careful that managers who are not particularly adept at being good managers, they may blame their employees and use this as an excuse. And it sometimes is accurate, but sometimes it is not. It's just something to consider. Positive attitudes from employees, and you can get a positive attitude by treating people well, even if they tend to be more negative than not. If they are happy on the job and they have a positive attitude, that can be as contagious as having a bad attitude. Negative affectivity can be referred to sometimes in organizational behavior classes as a contagion. And contagion can work both ways. If somebody's a bad mood and they're treating people unfairly or they're snipping at people and they're answering them shortly, those people can get mad at that interaction and then they can go do the same thing to someone else, and before you know it, your entire staff is angry with one another. Conversely, if somebody has a good attitude and they see a problem and they come up with a positive way to fix it, they are responding to people in a professional, appropriate manner, that can also spread. And you can uplift everybody's mood and therefore increase job satisfaction being positive as well. Factors associated with a positive work attitude is keeping failures in perspective. Everybody makes mistakes at the job. Managers need to understand that their employees will make mistakes too. They're not always the end of the world, so you can usually learn from them and move on. That's the best way to keep it. You can almost look at a failure as a way to learn how to improve in the future. If you just have a failure and it's always going to be something negative, then that's going to lead to potentially more job dissatisfaction. If you can be a good manager and figure out a way to turn a failure into something positive where people will not continue to repeat those failures, learn from it, and then be satisfied that management is there to help them perform at a higher level, then things can turn for the better. The way that you can take care of job satisfaction and monitor it, as I said, you can hire people who are predisposed to being satisfied. It's easier said than done, but you can take some steps to try to hire people who are more positive and able to deal with issues in a more positive fashion. You can also refer to people that are struggling to their EAP program, their Employee Assistance Program, to try and get some help as well. You can design complex, meaningful jobs. You can do the things that we're talking about to make jobs more interesting. Make sure that there's no role ambiguity. The roles are clear and people are doing the work that they have been assigned and that they're qualified to do. You want to reinforce the values of the organization, encourage social support, help people pursue their goals, whether it's through their job career path or mentoring and coaching. All of those things can help make the job more interesting and leave employees more satisfied. Also making sure that people have benefits and pay that are at a satisfactory level that will keep them satisfied. Making sure that people understand how the pay factors work and the structures work through your policies is important as well. If somebody didn't get a raise, they may think that they're being treated unfairly. But again, if you have a process and you're following that process, it only helps people understand that they're being treated fairly if they know what that process is in the first place. Oftentimes people, when they don't have information, they operate from an information vacuum. They assume things are bad or they assume the worst about something. When they have information, as I said, they may agree or disagree with it, but they're less likely to be dissatisfied with how things play out if they know that they're being treated fairly. The next graph just shows the steps and role analysis techniques. So you want to make sure that people understand what their job is, what their roles are, what the expectations are. Make a list of all the duties and behaviors. This can tie back going to the first couple of chapters about the job description and the job analysis as well. You can build on that doing this as an exercise with your employees to make sure that they understand the requirements of the position. Now, making jobs more complex and meaningful can increase job satisfaction, but not all jobs are going to be very exciting, and they're not always going to be complex and meaningful. That's why things like job rotation can help. However, some jobs are just going to be difficult to get through, and it's making sure that people keep a positive attitude by understanding that their job, even if it seems to be relatively minor or not complex, it's still important. And the job, what they're doing, is a piece of what the entire organization is doing. And if they don't do the job, it's going to hamper the ability for the organization to achieve its ultimate mission. So every job can be viewed as being important, and it's just important to make sure people understand that it's communicated to them. Supervisors and coworkers, it's important to make sure that they're trained on the policies and procedures, that they understand what the corporate culture should be. They want to make sure that they share the same values, attitudes, and philosophies with each other and with the organization. They should be providing social support to their employees, keeping them satisfied. That can help reduce turnover. You want to help an employee get a valued outcome, something that's important to them, maybe getting training, helping to move up in their development program. You can also use team building activities that we've talked about in earlier chapters to help lead to job satisfaction. HR should take a look at pay levels to make sure that the people who are working in your company are getting paid a commensurate competitive salary for the industry and for the job type that they have. People who are satisfied with the pay structure tend to be more satisfied with the work on the job. They tend to not leave as often. The way that you can monitor job satisfaction, you can use surveys quite frequently. If you're not sure if people are happy with the job, by all means, go ahead and ask them. And a survey is a good way to ask multiple people in different job areas so that you can collect information and assess it. Other things that can happen is exit interviews are good. Very rarely do they actually happen, especially if people are quitting. They don't necessarily want to say something bad about it. If they're really angry and they quit because they hated their job, getting an exit interview may just be nothing more than a gripe session. So they could provide some information, but you have to understand where it's coming from. So take it with a grain of salt. However, a lot of companies do not do exit interviews, and there is some value in it as long as they're conducted appropriately. Stay interviews are when you talk to people who are with the company because you want to make sure that they are satisfied. If these are your high performers, you want to make sure that they're satisfied. What can we do to make things better? How can we get you to stay with the company? Are you being paid appropriately? Are there issues that need to be addressed? A lot of companies also don't do that, but it is something that can be done, and it's more individual than it would be to do a survey. The survey can help you get some bigger picture items, maybe by department. One department is more satisfied than the other, and one group of employees is more satisfied than the other. You could target the ones through the surveys that have the most issues, and then take the time to actually interview them to find out a little bit more so that you can take the appropriate steps to keep job satisfaction high and ensure employee retention. The next slide just has an example of a job descriptive index. This is a worksheet that people could fill out. You ask people to think about their job, fill it out. Is the work itself, is it routine, is it satisfying, is it good? These are the types of questions that you can ask someone through these surveys to determine if they are satisfied on the job. This next one, I'm not sure if a lot of companies would use something like this. It reminds me of the doctor's office when they ask you how much pain you're feeling. It's just a way to get a quick response rather than putting something into words, a smiley face and a frowny face. I guess that's the easiest way to determine whether somebody's happy at the job. This would be a more generic way to do it. Obviously, you want to have more detailed questions, but this is a quick and easy way to get a response as to how someone is feeling about the job. Then you can look at the following questions and dig a little bit deeper and even do these individual interviews later on. That's the end of Chapter 11. You can read the summary slides and go through the materials in the book as well.